They found what many archaeologists believe is King David's palace, but the discovery, far from confirming his biblical grandeur, actually deepens the debate around his historical reality, suggesting a much more complicated truth than the one we often imagine. This isn't just about a few old stones. It challenges the very foundations of how we understand one of history's most revered figures and the origins of a kingdom central to billions of people. For generations, King David has stood as a towering figure, the shepherd boy turned king, the slayer of Goliath, the unifier of Israel, and the ancestor of a messianic line. His story, told with vivid detail in the Hebrew Bible, paints a picture of a powerful monarch ruling a vast and prosperous kingdom from his capital in Jerusalem. But what if the very evidence that claims to pinpoint his royal residence tells a different story about the scale of his reign? A story that pushes us to reconsider if the David we know from Scripture ever truly walked the dusty hills of Judea as an undisputed king. What version of King David's story did you grow up with? Was it the triumphant hero, the flawed but ultimately righteous ruler, or perhaps a more mythical figure? We want to hear how his legend has shaped your understanding. For centuries, the story of King David has been etched into our collective consciousness. We envision Jerusalem, his capital, as a bustling metropolis, the heart of a unified monarchy stretching from the Euphrates to Egypt, a golden age of ancient Israel. The book of Samuel and Chronicles describe a king who conquered, built, and established a dynasty, a powerful leader whose fame spread throughout the ancient Near East. They tell us he captured Jerusalem, transforming it from a Jebusite stronghold into his royal city, the city of David. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there, established a powerful central government, and even planned for a magnificent temple, which his son Solomon would later build. The scale of this operation, according to the Bible, was immense, requiring vast resources, skilled craftsmen, and a highly organized administration. It was a kingdom that could command allegiance, levy taxes, and project power. This is the Davidic Empire that generations have revered, a historical touchstone. Now, imagine the thrill of an archaeologist digging in the sun-baked soil of Israel, unearthing walls, pottery, and artifacts that date precisely to the 10th century BCE, the very period the Bible attributes to David's reign. For decades, many scholars believed that direct archaeological evidence for the unified monarchy of David and Solomon was frustratingly absent. The biblical narrative spoke of grand constructions, yet the spades turned up little to match such descriptions. Then, starting in the early 2000s, several sites began to yield tantalizing clues, promising to bridge the gap between text and dirt. One particular site, an ancient fortified city called Kiriath, located in the Elah Valley, the very valley where David supposedly fought Goliath, provided a stunning breakthrough. Excavated by Professor Joseph Garfinkel, Kiriath presented massive fortifications, 2 gates, and a sophisticated urban plan. But most importantly, carbon dating placed its occupation squarely within the late 11th to early 10th century BCE, precisely the period of David's emergence. Garfinkel and his team proclaimed that they had found a Judean city from the time of David, a crucial piece of evidence for the nascent kingdom. They pointed to the distinctive architectural style, the types of pottery, and even an ostracon, a pottery shard with an inscription, which some believe contains the earliest known Hebrew writing. This discovery was widely celebrated as a vindication of the biblical account, a concrete historical anchor for the stories of David. It was seen as proof that Judea had complex urban centers and a state-level organization precisely when the Bible said David was rising to power. The scale of the fortifications at Kiriath suggested a significant political entity, not just a collection of tribal villages. It felt like the archaeological world had finally caught up to the biblical narrative, providing a tangible link to the shepherd king. But the story doesn't end there, and this is where the plot thickens. Simultaneously, another prominent archaeologist, Dr. Eilat Mazar, was digging in Jerusalem itself, in an area known as the City of David, just south of the Temple Mount. Mazar, a firm believer in the historical accuracy of the biblical text, specifically targeted a massive stone structure, which she enthusiastically identified as King David's palace. Her excavations unearthed monumental walls, some reaching several meters thick, and a massive platform. The size and construction quality were truly impressive for the period. Carbon dating of pottery fragments and other organic material found within the structure again pointed to the 10th century BCE. For Mazar, this was it, the physical heart of David's kingdom, a grand residence befitting a powerful king, located precisely where the Bible placed it. The excitement was palpable. News agencies worldwide picked up the story. King David's palace discovered. The long-standing debate about David's existence, it seemed, was finally settled. Here was concrete evidence, monumental architecture, matching the biblical timeline and location. For those who sought archaeological confirmation of the biblical narrative, Mazar's large stone structure in Jerusalem and Garfinkel's fortified city at Khirbet Qeiyafa provided powerful arguments. They suggested that the unified monarchy was not a later literary invention, but a historical reality, complete with administrative centers and royal residences. It seemed the Spades had finally confirmed the scrolls. But this is where we encounter the honest, often messy reality of archaeology. As Garfinkel and Mazar celebrated their findings as proof of David's kingdom, other scholars, examining the same evidence, arrived at radically different conclusions. For them, these very discoveries, while significant, actually undermine the traditional biblical picture of a grand unified monarchy ruling from a magnificent Jerusalem. The central tension lies in the scale of the findings versus the scale of the biblical description. When the text talks about a vast empire, archaeologists expect to find extensive urban centers, sophisticated infrastructure, a clear administrative hierarchy reflected in material culture across a wide geographical area. What they often find, however, is far more modest. Let's take Khirbet Qeiyafa first. While it's a significant fortified site, critics argue that calling it a Judean city of David's time is an interpretation, not a certainty. They point out that its material culture doesn't unequivocally shout Judean. Some scholars have even proposed it could have been a Philistine city, or perhaps a neutral border town. Even if it was Judean, its size, while impressive for a local settlement, is not indicative of an imperial capital or a major administrative hub of a powerful kingdom. It appears to be a regional stronghold, perhaps even a nascent state's attempt to control a specific valley, but it doesn't reflect the extensive political and economic reach implied by the Bible's united monarchy. The palace found within Khirbet Qeiyafa, while a substantial building, is not on the scale one would expect for a grand monarch's residence. It is more like a large chieftain's house. Then there's Eilat Mazar's large stone structure in Jerusalem. While truly monumental, the question remains, is it David's palace? Critics argue that while the dating places it in the general time frame, attributing it specifically to David is a leap. The Bible describes David's palace as having been built by Hiram, king of Tyre, using cedar wood and skilled craftsmen. While Mazar found impressive stones, the architectural style and specific features don't definitively link it to the biblical description or to Phoenician influence in a way that satisfies all scholars. More critically, the Jerusalem of the 10th century BCE, as revealed by archaeology, appears to have been a relatively small provincial town, perhaps only a few hectares in size. A monumental structure like Mazar's palace would have dominated this small settlement, but it doesn't fit the image of a thriving, sprawling capital city described in the Bible. This disparity leads to a crucial question. What does a king and a kingdom look like in the 10th century BCE in the Levant? For some scholars, known as minimalists, the archaeological record suggests that what the Bible calls a united monarchy was, at best, a collection of loosely confederated tribal groups, perhaps with a charismatic local leader like David. Jerusalem itself, they argue, was little more than a fortified village, and any palace would have been a chieftain's residence, not a grand imperial complex. The biblical narrative, from this perspective, is seen as a much later literary creation, perhaps from the Persian or Hellenistic periods, retroactively projecting a glorious past onto a much humbler reality, serving ideological purposes for a later community. They suggest that the tales of David and Solomon are foundational myths, not historical accounts in the modern sense. So, if these palaces don't quite fit the biblical grandeur, what does archaeology show us about the 10th century BCE? It shows us a region in transition. The great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia were in decline, creating a power vacuum. This allowed smaller local entities to emerge. We see fortified settlements, evidence of nascent social stratification, and the development of distinct regional cultures, including what might be Proto-Israelite or Proto-Judean entities. We see evidence of local rulers and administrative centers, but nothing on the scale of a vast centralized empire dominating the entire region. The picture is one of small chiefdoms or early state formations, often in conflict with each other. This is a very different landscape from the one painted in the books of Samuel and Kings. Now let's consider a piece of evidence that does suggest a historical house of David, the Tel Dan stele. Discovered in northern Israel in the 1990s, this basalt slab dates to the 9th century BCE, about a century after David's supposed reign. It bears an Aramaic inscription commemorating a victory by an Aramaean king over his enemies, and it explicitly mentions the House of David, Beit David in Hebrew. This is the only extra-biblical inscription found to date that refers to David, or more precisely, to a dynasty or kingdom named after him. For many scholars, this inscription is the strongest piece of archaeological evidence for the historical existence of David as the founder of a ruling lineage in Jerusalem. It suggests that by the 9th century BCE, a ruling house called House of David was a recognized political entity in the region, known to neighboring kingdoms. But even the Tel Dan stele, while incredibly significant, doesn't definitively prove the biblical David, the one who fought Goliath and ruled a unified empire. It merely indicates that a dynasty called House of David existed a century later. The nature and extent of this House of David are still open to interpretation. Was it the powerful empire described in the Bible, or a smaller regional kingdom? The stele doesn't specify.
What it does tell us with archaeological certainty is that David was not a purely mythical figure invented centuries later, as some maximalists once argued. His name, or at least a dynasty bearing his name, was recognized in the political landscape of the ancient Near East within a century of his supposed lifetime. This distinction is crucial. The stele supports the idea of a historical Davidic dynasty, but doesn't necessarily validate the grand scale of the biblical narrative. So we are left with a fascinating paradox. We have monumental architecture from the 10th century BCE, a fortified city, and a massive structure in Jerusalem that could be David's palace or a significant administrative building. We also have an extra-biblical inscription confirming a House of David. Yet these pieces of evidence don't quite cohere into the grand tapestry woven by the biblical text. The archaeological record suggests a more modest reality for the 10th century BCE, a period of emerging statehood rather than a sprawling empire. This divergence forces us to confront the difference between what the text says, what archaeology shows, and what scholars debate. The text speaks of David and Solomon as ruling a unified kingdom. Archaeology shows much smaller, separate political entities in Judah and Israel during much of the Iron Age 2A. Consider the different approaches taken by scholars. Some, often called maximalists, tend to give more weight to the biblical text, interpreting archaeological finds in a way that aligns with Scripture, even if it requires stretching the interpretation of the material remains. For them, Hirbit Kaifa and Mazar's structure are direct evidence of the biblical kingdom. Others, the minimalists, are much more skeptical of the Bible's historical claims, viewing it primarily as theological literature with a limited historical basis. For them, the archaeological silence regarding a grand empire is deafening, and they see the palaces as evidence of small local chiefdoms that only later, much later, were romanticized into an empire. Then there's the more nuanced, centrist view, which is perhaps where the majority of scholars now stand. This perspective acknowledges that the biblical narrative likely contains a kernel of historical truth, a historical David, a nascent Judean polity, and the emergence of something that would eventually become a kingdom. However, it also recognizes that the biblical accounts, written centuries after the events they describe, are not pure history. They're theological narratives shaped by the needs and perspectives of later generations, often exaggerating, idealizing, and consolidating disparate traditions into a single powerful story. From this viewpoint, the palaces of the 10th century BCE might represent the very beginnings of a Judean state, the humble origins from which the later, grander narratives sprang. This perspective doesn't deny the existence of a historical David. It simply redefines what that existence might have looked like. Instead of a powerful empire, David might have been a charismatic tribal leader, a big man who managed to unite several clans in the Judean hills. His palace would have been a significant residence for its time, but not a lavish imperial complex. His kingdom would have been a nascent political entity, perhaps controlling a limited territory around Jerusalem rather than an empire stretching across the entire region. The biblical narrative, then, would be seen as a later, retrospective glorification of these origins, attributing a scale and sophistication to the earliest period that developed only much later. This doesn't make the stories less important or powerful, but it places them in a different historical context.
The ongoing debate about David's palace and the scale of his kingdom highlights a fundamental tension in biblical archaeology. How do we reconcile the sacred texts with the often sparse and ambiguous material record? When we dig, we don't find libraries of royal decrees or biographies of kings. We find pottery shards, foundations of buildings, discarded tools, and the remnants of everyday life. Interpreting these fragments and assembling them into a coherent picture of the past requires careful scholarship, rigorous methodology, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable conclusions. The very notion of finding a palace from the 10th century BCE is exciting, but its meaning is deeply contested. Is it the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy, or is it a small piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle that reshapes our understanding of ancient Israel? The significance of these archaeological findings extends beyond just one king. It influences our entire understanding of the formation of Israel and Judah as distinct political entities. Did they emerge as powerful, centralized kingdoms from the outset, as the Bible implies, or did they evolve slowly, from smaller tribal groupings into chiefdoms, and then much later into more established states? The archaeological record from the 10th century BCE overwhelmingly points to the latter, suggesting a gradual process of state formation rather than an immediate, widespread empire under David and Solomon. This doesn't erase the biblical story, but it recontextualizes it, inviting us to read it with an appreciation for its literary and theological aims alongside its historical claims. Ultimately, the search for King David's palace and the conflicting interpretations of what has been found doesn't diminish the enduring power of his story. Whether David ruled a vast empire or a small, nascent kingdom, his legacy is profound. His narratives offer timeless insights into leadership, faith, human frailty, and the struggles of power. The archaeological findings, instead of simply confirming or denying, add layers of nuance and complexity to his story. They challenge us to think critically about our sources, both textual and material, and to embrace the ambiguity that is inherent in reconstructing a distant past.
The dialogue between the biblical text and the archaeological shovel is not always harmonious, but it is always enriching. It forces us to ask deeper questions about how history is made, how it is recorded, and how it is remembered. What we can say with confidence is that the 10th century BCE was a period of significant activity in the Judean hills. Fortified settlements like Hirbet Kaiafa existed. Monumental architecture like the large stone structure in Jerusalem was being built. And by the 9th century BCE, a ruling entity known as the House of David was recognized by neighboring powers. These are concrete archaeological facts. However, the honest edge of what we cannot definitively state is whether these findings fully correspond to the grand unified kingdom described in the biblical accounts of King David. The evidence suggests a period of early state formation, a much smaller scale reality than the biblical narrative portrays. So, while we may have found a palace from the general time of David, its discovery prompts more questions than it answers about the legendary king. It invites us into a deeper, more nuanced understanding of ancient history, where the lines between historical fact and powerful narrative are often blurred. The debate continues, driven by new discoveries and fresh interpretations, reminding us that the past is never a static, settled story, but a dynamic conversation between texts, artifacts, and the endless human quest for meaning. What we can say with confidence is that the 10th century BCE was a period of significant activity in the Judean hills. Fortified settlements like Hirbet Kaiafa existed. Monumental architecture like the large stone structure in Jerusalem was being built. And by the 9th century BCE, a ruling entity known as the House of David was recognized by neighboring powers. These are concrete archaeological facts. However, the honest edge of what we cannot definitively state is whether these findings fully correspond to the grand unified kingdom described in the biblical accounts of King David. The evidence suggests a period of early state formation, a much smaller scale reality than the biblical narrative portrays. So, while we may have found a palace from the general time of David, its discovery prompts more questions than it answers about the legendary king. It invites us into a deeper, more nuanced understanding of ancient history, where the lines between historical fact and powerful narrative are often blurred. The debate continues, driven by new discoveries and fresh interpretations, reminding us that the past is never a static, settled story, but a dynamic conversation between texts, artifacts, and the endless human quest for meaning.